say. You think I'm crying on my own, well I ain't. And I didn't wanna write a song, cause I didn't want anyone thinking I still care or don't.
Good evening, welcome to African Drums. I'm Elsie and I'm glad you've joined me this evening. Local government elections are just a few days away. It will be the first such elections in 22 years. There is much talk about what the outcome of these elections would mean for the political process, given the fact that there seems to be low voter interest. This and other related questions I will put to our panel tonight. The members of this panel are no strangers to African drums. Mr. Vincent Alexander is a member of the Cuffy 250 committee and is very knowledgeable about local government elections. And Sharma Solomon is the former regional chairman for Region 10 and a former councillor for the Linden municipality. Gentlemen, welcome again to African Drums.
Thank you very much, Elsie.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so the first thing I want to ask you to do is tell our audience, why did it take so long for us to have local government elections?
It seems to be a tradition to take long because the sequence is we had elections in 1961, 1970, and 1994. Funnily enough, on each of those occasions, the question of reform seemed to be the intervening factor, that there was need for reform. And so we had a reform in 1970, we had a reform in 1980, we had the implementation of reform in 1994, and then we are having the implementation of reform again at this point in time. So reform always seemed to be an intervening factor in us not having elections. But I would submit humbly that in addition to the instances of reform, and I've said on all three occasions we've had a reform process, there also has been a certain degree of unwillingness about holding these elections.
Okay, so, well, before I ask Mr. Solomon his take on it, why do you think there is a degree of unwillingness to have local government elections?
Particularly, I want to restrict that comment to the present context. I'm not sure that we have gone through this process as a matter of commitment. I'm sure that some of what we have done is a matter of expediency. And you should know that the reform process I'm referring to really came about after the 1997 elections, when we moved to have reform in relation to the Constitution. And then out of that reform, it was determined that because of the new provisions in the Constitution on local government, there was need for reform of the local government system. Now, I'm not quite sure that there was a 100% commitment to this. I feel that in a sense it's out of the circumstances of 1997 that led us into this. And so the deeper you get into it, the more you get to realize the parties are forced into it rather than willingly into it. And I think that that is a factor that has contributed to what I would term the unwillingness.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Solomon, why do you think it took so long to have local government elections?
And good night to everyone. I'd like to agree with Vincent on the fact that we needed those reforms and they were crucial. But I'd like to also take this in a very deep way of in the giving over of power, how we allow power to be surrendered to the people. And if you look at the history of Guyana, it's always been a challenge. 1834, 1838, though we were given our freedom, we had to wait some time before we mature to appreciate that freedom. 1966, and when we had independence, the republic, we had to wait another 4 years. And Vincent just gave the years of having to see those reforms work towards local government. It is the devolution of power. It is how do you surrender power to the people? And I believe, though we are seeing local government evolve to the state it is that we will have a hybrid system come Friday, I believe there are much more reforms that are needed. And I see that as tied to those that are holding power, willingness, and the willingness as Vincent speak about, to give that power to citizens. And it is the history of our nation that I believe at some point in time we'll have to overcome, where those who are in charge of the system are prepared to hand power over to the people.
Okay. Can you explain for our audience what is the difference between local government and central government?
To a large extent, the difference between local government and central government is spatial, in the sense that central government is responsible for the delivery of goods and services, for regulating the lives of people throughout the length and breadth of the country. Local government, on the other hand, has responsibility, similar responsibility, in a specific geographic area, and it is not responsible for all that takes place in that area. It's responsible for a certain number of regulatory aspects and goods and services delivery, so that they're all government. In the case of Ghana, they're all elected. In the case of Ghana, they all get their originating authority from the Constitution. But the central government looks after things which are germane to the entire country: monetary issues, fiscal issues, defense, law enforcement, foreign affairs. Local government is supposed to look after things that are germane to the local area. So things that are unique, particular to the local area, so drainage, roads, recreation, markets, abattoirs, some bit of security, things that are particular to the local area. It's really, once you see local government in the context of a concept called subsidiarity, where it is argued that people should be allowed to do things which are close to them and which could be best done by them.
Okay, and what are the origins of local government system in Guyana?
Interesting question. I think the best point of origin is 1838, with the emancipation movement. The freed slaves moved into villages and actually established management committees for those villages. So in other words, they established governance systems for those villages. Those governance systems, over time, in the first instance, they were voluntary governance systems, systems of the people, for the people. But over time, they became statist and took on that nomenclature of government itself. And so I think 1838 could be seen as the origin of local government, with the establishment of management committees in the villages of the freed Africans.
Okay. Mr. Solomon, you are a councillor for the Linden municipality. So I'm going to ask you, how does local government enhance the democratic process?
I believe in its current state, it will be a challenge in terms of the fact that the persons that are going to be affected the most, who are the people, in the current state are not involved in the process. I believe in having these reforms that we spoke of earlier, you're now going to have people having an opportunity to identify more closely those who are going to lead their communities. At that point of being part of a council and being identified from a list of candidates, I can say to you the level of commitment to your community is not the same as to be elected by your community. And I believe now people are being given that opportunity to identify their leaders and to have them be held accountable to those individuals in the community. So it is very encouraging now, but I can say to you the fact that these opportunities now exist, you will be able to get more, I believe, out of your councillors, because they now have to work based on accountability and demonstrate good stewardship of holding such office of local representatives of the people. So you now have both parties in a position where you can see people having to work on behalf of people, while at the same time communities having the opportunities to hold persons accountable by either recalling them, having them to face challenge of candidates within the communities. Those are things that will stimulate more performance out of candidates, I believe, or at least councillors, in fact, and at least encourage people to pay more attention to what is going on. So local government affords those opportunities. I think we always say that all politics is local. Before you get to the national leaders, you have locally people who can take your issues on and represent them before you take them to the national level.
Okay. Mr. Alexander, in your experience with local government elections, how does it enhance the democratic process?
Well, first of all, I would say that one should note that there are two elements to local government in Guyana. And I say in Guyana because in some places local government is purely administrative. It's not a part of the democratic system. It's a part of the administrative system for the delivery of goods and services. And in those instances, the bodies are sometimes not even elected. They're appointed bodies by the central government. It's really an attempt to be more efficient in delivery of goods and services. In the case of Guyana, we have a system that on one hand is administrative, isn't involved in the actual delivery of goods and services. On the other hand, it's political because it's a part of the democratic process where the local area is governed by an elected body of people. And in that sense, one can see local government as a part of inclusivity. How do you expand the number of people who are involved in the political process and the decision making across the country? So local government, in a sense, speaks to, in the case of Guyana, the Article 13 of our Constitution, which talks about inclusivity. And inclusivity is itself one of the cardinal principles of good governance. So that local government is a part of that system of good governance, and it's a part of the democratic process of involving people in the decision making. So that, yes, theoretically, local government lends to democracy, it lends to good governance, it lends to the expansion of the political system, but one then has to see how that works. And in a sense, one may argue that the electoral system lends to what I spoke about or could detract from what I speak about. In most countries, the local government system is built on the system of constituency elections rather than the PR arrangement. In Guyana, we have a PR arrangement which, in my view, can detract from the democracy we're talking about, because the tendency in the PR system, particularly where you have a open list, is for the people who are listed to be enlisted by their party, and in the conduct of the affairs of the local authority to look to the party because they are servants, creatures of the party, more than to look to the people who they should be serving. So that, to me, the electoral system impacts on the extent to which one can realize the objectives. Now, we have now embarked upon a system that's hybrid, introduces the concept of constituencies, and therefore I think we can see a movement in the direction of the real democracy in terms of people's involvement in decision making, and in terms of people being accountable to those who would have elected them.
Okay, on the matter of there being these two sections to the local government elections, and this is a very controversial issue apparently, should political parties contest local government elections?
I would not, as a matter of principle, say no. Not as a matter of principle, say no. Political parties that are grounded with the people, that have local units and all of that, could well serve a good purpose in terms of participating in the election. Because when councils are elected, they need to work with people. They don't need to be on their own. And a political party that has a good ground structure, can provide the infrastructure for those councillors to be able to penetrate the local communities and to work with them. So in principle, I would say no. I would say yes. But one has to look at the peculiarity of Guyana. And I think that we have become too bogged down, particularly the PR system, with the struggle between the political parties, sometimes to the detriment to addressing issues and involving people and things like that. And so I would have some reservations of the extent to which political parties should be involved. I think that in Guyana, local government could become a part of the solution of our problem by virtue of the non-involvement of political parties and trying to make the local authorities more non-partisan, trying to make them more concerned about issues rather than about political power. And so I have reservations about the extent to which, particularly in the neighborhood democratic councils, where the issues are really life issues, fundamental day-to-day issues. I don't think people should have political differences about the supply of water, about the fixing of drains, about the fixing of roads. Those things are things, this is not a monetary question where you have a different theory, monetary theory, and therefore you want to pursue one or the other based on your ideological disposition. This is everyday life. And you really don't need politicians to become too involved in those everyday life issues and splitting constituencies based on political loyalty, when in fact the issues to be addressed are homogeneous issues to the community at large.
Okay. Mr. Solomon, what is your take on it?
I take it back to the root of the purpose of local government. I think Vincent mentioned earlier about the establishment of the village council, the village movement. And it was the fact of the powers that be that hijacked the village movement to ensure that they have some level of involvement. I think we are going to transition, we are going to find those reforms. I think maybe after a cycle or two of local government, we will see a more vocal approach towards really having power given to the people in a real, true sense of local government. But I also see the fact that political parties take the opportunity to use local government as an opportunity to prepare people maybe to represent at a higher level. I know it is an explanation by some parties that at the level of a town council or a local democratic council, you have people being prepared to maybe enter parliament and to also give better representation, which allows them to know the issues at a very germane level before they get to the national level to give representation. I know those are some of the arguments. However, I believe that at the very local level, you should have even the greatest democracy in the world. You have, though, for example, the mayor of New York being a Democrat. It is not the national party that gets into the politics of New York at that level to promote and financially support and in a very ideological way sell that candidate. It is the people within the community, as within our country, whether it's our towns, our neighborhoods, that will be able to identify those leaders that they are certain will act in their interest and on their behalf. So I think it will evolve with time. I believe so deeply. Like everything else in Guyana, the political system and the powers that be, people will have an opportunity to learn what is advantageous for them in terms of having a council that is purely identified by them on the constituency basis rather than the political parties. But in the meantime, I see it as an opportunity where all are allowed to benefit and learn. But I believe in time, we will see a more stronger approach to having the constituency approach towards local government rather than the political parties involved.
And so I think Sharma made a very important point, the role of the constituency approach. Because you raised a question as to political parties' involvement versus the non-involvement. one could well have a situation where they are involved, but when you have the constituency approach, then even though they were involved, there is a greater connectivity between the candidates and the people. And so their involvement is not as negative as when you don't have a constituency approach. And that's why you, in a sense, we're moving towards the constituency approach. And one should also note that, in fact, there were those who felt we should go for the constituency approach. But where we have arrived at is a sense of compromise between the major political parties. I would argue that at the time of the reform, the feeling of the opposition at that time was to go for constituencies. But the government was resistant to that, and what we have is, in a sense, a compromise, and therefore it's for us to work towards what is more ideal. And indeed in local government, we are really a strange community in that we have PR. The tendency in local government is for us to have more of the constituency type arrangement. So the question might well turn out to be not whether political parties should be involved or not, but whether the involvement should be through constituency politics as opposed to this generalized PR arrangement.
Okay. So we've been using words like PR and constituency during our discussion so far, but I'm sure a lot of people in the audience don't even know what you're referring to when you say PR. So can you explain for the audience how the local government system works? And I know you've been doing this a lot.
A long time.
I think this is a very apt question, because I think I must confess being guilty tonight of doing what I was trying to undo in many other circumstances, because these terms have been terms that create some confusion in terms of the local government system that we are now trying to implement. And so, in an attempt to explain this, probably we can simply look at our balloting arrangements, how people are going to vote in these elections. In these elections, people are going to have a ballot paper that has two parts, the top and the bottom. Each local government area will have half of its councillors elected by the votes on the top part of the ballot paper, and the other half elected by the votes on the bottom part of the ballot paper. So, if you take Georgetown, for example, they have 30 councillors, 15 will be elected based on what's on the top part of the ballot paper, and 15 on what's on the bottom part of the ballot paper. And what is required simply is for a voter, when voting, on the top part of the ballot paper, to vote for a party or a group of choice. That part will only have parties and groups. You will see the name, you will see the symbol of the party or group, and they vote for the party or group of choice. And so it's a competition among parties or groups. There are no individuals featuring on that ballot paper. All of the individuals there are on a list that the party would have put up, indicating its intention to contest for those half of those seats, those 15 seats in the case of Georgetown. So what happens in the case of Georgetown, or any instance, the total number of votes cast are determined. That total number of votes cast is then divided by the total number of seats being contested for. That gives you the value of one seat. And then parties are allocated seats based on the number of votes they got in proportion. Seats in proportion to the number of votes they got. So if we take, for example, if we suggest that Georgetown, on the top half of that, top part of the ballot paper, you're voting for 15 seats. And you're just ticking off your party or group. Then let's assume that there are 150 persons who voted. This is just a sample. And there are 15 seats. It means each seat is equivalent to 10 votes. And so when you look at the number of votes a party get, then you would see that if they have 10 votes, they get 1 seat, 20 votes, 2 seats, in proportion. And so 15 seats in Georgia will be allocated that way based on the number of votes a party gets in relation to what's the value of a seat. And because it is a situation where the seats are distributed in ratio form, If you get 10 votes, you get 1 seat. If you get 20 votes, you get 2 seats. If you get 30 votes, you get 3 seats. Then it is proportionate. There's proportionality between the number of votes you get, the number of seats you get. And it's that simple proportionality that we call PR, proportional representation. People are represented in the council by a party in proportion to the number of votes the party got. If you got half of the votes, you get half of the seats. And half of the overall number of seats will be allocated simply that way. The other half...
Now, before you get there, Vincent, that also will give the party the prerogative to choose the candidates that will get the council.
From the list.
From the list. So if there are 28 persons on that list, it is the party's prerogative. You have already given your vote to that party, and they will then identify those candidates that they believe will work best in the council.
And I think that's good to point out to the audience so that they know that, okay, you do not have the authority to choose that specific person.
Well, in fact, in the first part, there is no provision for you to choose a person. Exactly. You're just choosing the party. The party then, after the elections, would go to the list, a list which they have published in advance, and say these are the persons we are picking based on the number of seats that's been allocated to us. So that's what that system does. Okay. Unlike the other half, in the other half, what has happened, each local authority area has been divided into constituencies equivalent to half of the number of seats. So Georgetown has 30 seats. 15 constituencies have been created for the purpose of elections. And what happens? You have, in a sense, in each constituency they have their own election. They have persons nominated from the constituency by people from the constituency. It could be a party, it could be a group, it could be an individual who is unrelated to a party or a group. Once they have the number of signatures, they come forward as nominees to contest for that seat in that constituency. So each constituency will be having a contest for one seat. And what the voters essentially have to do is express a preference which of the candidates they prefer. Now here is where you will see the name of the party, the symbol, and the picture of the person the party is putting up, the name of the group, the symbol, and the picture of the person the group is putting up. And in the instance where the person is what we call independent, you will not see a party's name, you'll just see an individual, the person has a symbol, and the person's picture. And what is required for the voter to express a preference of one of those persons. At the end of the election, they simply total up the votes each person got, and the person with the highest number of votes is the elected person for that constituency. And that is what they call first past the post.
I think the first past the post is much simpler in my mind than the proportional representation, because you're simply selecting the person that you want, and depending on if they get the majority of the votes,
it is simpler, but there's a history to PR that gives some validity to the use of PR. PR is not peculiar to Guyana. It is something very much found in Europe. In Europe, and in fact, the hybrid system we've adopted is a system found a lot in Europe and in the Nordic and Scandinavian countries. We can at another time go into the justification with PR.
Yes.
We did not always have PR. PR came in 1964 as a prelude to independence. We used to have constituencies in the past. There were issues with that. We now have PR. We've now discovered that PR is not perfect. And so we've moved to a hybrid, both at national elections and local elections, but it is more distinct at the local elections because of the way in which we have constituted our constituencies and the way in which we have divorced PR from the constituencies. They are two separate elections in a sense. At the national level, they're intertwined.
Okay, good. There have been some changes for this election, I'm told. Can you tell us what those changes are and how they enhance the system? And I'm only asking Vincent because, this is his forte.
Definitely. Definitely.
Well, the change essentially is what we just talked about. In the past, we had only PR. So in the past, what happened, contestants participated through their party list or the group list. And so you cast one vote, and all of the seats were allocated based on proportional representation. The disadvantage of that is that the citizens were not allowed to determine the specific person for whom they were voting, and there was no direct relationship between a candidate and a smaller geographical area. The system has now changed, so you have some people elected by PR, and that's general, and those elected by the constituency arrangement allows now for citizens in pockets of a local government area to know this is my candidate. It's now creating a connectivity, and in that regard, as we said earlier, enhancing the democratic process by virtue of creating this connectivity, accountability, a relationship between the elected and the electors, a direct relationship. And so one could expect now that the citizens could look to a councillor, demand accountability, the councillor could look to the citizens and ask for support, and so there's a mutual relationship that enhances the conduct of the work of the council, because it's now all about the councillor and the citizens, how the council responds to the citizens, how the citizens respond to the councillor, and how collectively they take the community forward.
Okay, while that constituency bit is good for voter satisfaction, as you would say, but there is no mechanism to recall a councillor. So say, Mr. Solomon, you're elected in the Linden municipality, and the voters are not satisfied, or the community members are not satisfied that you are doing what you were elected to do. Since there is no mechanism to recall you from being a councillor and put somebody else until your term for serving has expired, how do we mitigate that situation?
Let me cut in there and say
okay, sure.
Let me cut in there and say two things. First of all, if one goes back to the reform process, this issue of recall was big on the agenda.
Exactly.
But we haven't again had the political will. The idea was that there should be a mechanism for a recall of individual councillors through petition. That's virtually in the original report of the task force for local government. We haven't had the political will to do that. However, that notwithstanding, there is a mechanism for I wouldn't call it recall in the typical sense, for dissolution of the councils. This whole idea that we have gone through of IMCs is grounded in the law. It allows for citizens, if they are dissatisfied with the performance not of a councillor, but of the council, to put up a petition asking for an investigation into the performance of the council, after which investigation there may be a pronouncement that sees the council being dissolved and an interim body being put in its place. So there is a mechanism for recalling the council, whilst there's no mechanism for recalling the councillor.
Okay. And by the way, that mechanism is to be activated by the commission, whereas before that would have been by the minister. So simultaneous to local government Friday and the establishment of councils, there is also the expectation for the establishment of the commission, which will be the overseer, if you call it that. And I think Vincent can give a much more in-depth analysis of that, because I too have some take on that, and I think the composition of that is very important to the independence of allowing the local democratic system to work.
Okay, so can you tell us about this?
Well, to a large extent prior to now, local authorities are regulated by the ministry. Now, the problem you have with that is that inevitably the ministry is headed by a minister who's of a particular political party, and so political influence is brought into matters that could be administrative matters. And we have seen the history of this in terms of how IMCs have been created, in terms of how employment has been treated, particularly in the Georgetown municipality. I think Linden has had a similar problem with employment, and how the ministers have intervened in a manner that's clearly partisan. The idea behind the commission is to set up a non-partisan set of people who would then become the regulators, and the minister would step out of that role. So we do have the commission on law, should be established after elections.
And again, just before you go, sorry, Vincent, that is where you will take such petitions as Vincent spoke about earlier.
Right? So that if you want to dissolve, that's the body. The problem from my perspective is that, again, we haven't gone the full hog. My own view was and is that such a commission should be made up of people who bring expert knowledge to the work of the commission. So if you look at local government, you see they dabble with law, they dabble with engineering, they dabble with health, they dabble with accounting. And my view was that one should look to those fraternities to bring in people with those skills so that you can have a body of people who have the kind of knowledge that can oversee, from a professional perspective, local government. Unfortunately, again, given our political circumstances, we will end up with a commission, which I think is a 7-man commission, with the opposition probably nominating 3, the president nominating 3 in consideration of the opposition, and somebody is nominating 1. And so you don't have the guarantee that you will have a commission of the character, which in my view is required. Let's see what happens. Another learning curve we run.
And then, in the event that the commission does not reflect those skills that we need, there needs to be a mechanism to correct that as well.
Well, the reform is not
as we said,
ongoing.
the reforms are continuously ongoing. And as I mentioned before, the fact that the commission came up is that you may have an unwilling commission, as you may have had in the past unwilling ministers to execute the true desires of people. You may have very ineffective and inefficient councils who are not transparent and accountable in their actions, and you may have communities who may have sincere concerns of their functions and their functionalities. And those grievances, citizens may not be able to have redress for them. I want to have confidence in the change that we are seeing, and I am certain we will be able to, in the future, have more of that change in terms of systems of local government, whether those systems are within the electoral process of the hybrid PR and the first past the post, or whether that is in the interest of the commission, who, if you say, adjudicates or referees or act as a referee body in relation to lending support and to also addressing other issues that may come to the commission on behalf of citizens and the local authority. So I think it's a process that we'll go through, but nevertheless, it is not without its concerns, that if not properly managed and the proper oversight by citizens, it is a system that could be easily abused.
Okay, well, at the very least, at the very starting point, I'm happy to hear that this mechanism is in place, and I'm sure a lot of people in the public did not even know that this.
Well, the law is in place. They haven't yet established a commission.
Okay.
I'm told the ministry is doing some work towards its establishment. And, let's go back to the question of reform. We said we would hold back these elections to have the reform done. And the reform has aspects. The commission is one aspect of the reform. So that the election, in a sense, is the first stage of implementing the results of the reform, the elections. The commission then, therefore, should follow shortly after as the next stage.
Okay. On the issue of GECOM now, there have been a lot of complaints about GECOM's inadequate election education, so to speak. Do you think that this is a fair criticism of the Guyana Elections Commission?
Well, I don't know if Vincent may want to criticize it himself as one of the commissioners, but I can say, as someone who campaigned to ensure that we have these elections returned, and someone who believes strongly in having systems where we have democracy promoted, whether it's in Article 13 of that consultative, participatory, inclusionary issue. I think none of the sectors that are responsible for this election are without blame of the state, including the people in society, I think citizens are also not without blame, political parties and GECOM. So, in a very broad way, that is to give first answer to the question that everyone is with blame. I think we have taken for granted Friday is less than a week away, and as someone who have participated in mobilizing large numbers of people for the purpose of a common goal of moving society, moving communities forward, of addressing issues, and to come together, I believe that much more could have been done and should have been done. Not to say GECOM is not working, and I've been doing public education and public awareness campaign. But if you ask candidates, they can say to you that GECOM was slow to release information, materials, which made it difficult for their campaigns to actually get some traction. So people throw blame around, but I believe much more could have and should have been done by all, including GECOM.
Okay. Mr. Alexander, a fair assessment.
No, I don't have any significant difference from what Sharma has said. I mean, GECOM has to take collective responsibility, so that in that regard, I'm of GECOM. But certainly, I feel that GECOM could have started this work much earlier. I also feel that we haven't necessarily gotten on top of the pedagogy. They may still be, although GECOM is doing a lot of work now, spending huge sums of money, but I'm not sure that what they're doing really is connecting with the people, and so that may be a part of the problem. But I also, GECOM is responsible for the elections. But some people seem to think that GECOM is responsible for everything in terms of the education. And here's where I think that the other agencies, the ministry, for example, that should have been out there are doing much more. And I would go back to what is becoming a mantra of tonight's program, and unwillingness. You know, in the late 90s, am I correct, or the early 2000s, there were offers of funding to start the education. And there was clear instructions that it should not be done. GECOM, not GECOM, the task force had collectively agreed with funding from CEDA that we would start the education, because we had completed certain elements, particularly electoral elements was one of the first ones we completed. And this was 10 years ago. And though we had agreed and were talking to the Canadians, the government stepped in and said it wasn't the task force's business to do education, and so it was put on the back burner. And so clearly there's been political unwillingness to do education, and one has to ask the question, why that political act? Also, I think that the political parties have not done as much as they should have done as well in terms of education. They really should have started with the people who are going to be the candidates, should really be very knowledgeable of what they're getting involved in. And so, like Sharma, I agree that all of the sectors have been recalcitrant in terms of education, but I would underline that different sectors have been recalcitrant for different reasons. I think that's important to note. There are different reasons, and some of the reasons are not good reasons. Others are probably excusable.
Okay. We have just about 10 minutes left in the program, so we're going to try to get through all of the issues that we want to discuss. Sharma, as a former regional chairman and a councillor, what has been your experience with dealing with issues at that level?
I think, I believe to answer that question will not take into consideration that we now have a change in the system of, or the change of managers of the system. And I'm talking about the politics of 2015. Because you had, for example, as a council, and Vincent made the point, councils manage based on policies. You set policies, and then you have the administrative arm, whether it's at the town council, the town clerk, or at the region, the REO, and the administrators who would execute. Now, In the past, you had ministers who directly intervened. So what it actually did was made councils or councillors virtually non-existent in their effectiveness to participate in the development of communities and the lives of people. Many times you may have had implied the sort of tactics that guided you based on constitutional arrangements. So though you have 2801 that really allow the councils to work, you had ministers who subverted those laws and allowed themselves to be injected. So the difficulty then, I don't believe will exist now, and that is because people are more involved in the process, and it is allowed for more accountability and transparency. But I think we will have to go a little more further so that you wouldn't have that level of frustration that I am certain. However, I do hope the councillors across the 74 local democratic organs that will be conducting elections are allowed to really show good faith and restraint. It's going to be very frustrating, because if you don't have that sort of leverage to manage on behalf of people, there are high expectations, especially at that level, of leaders, local leaders. And when you cannot, based on resources available or allow based on scope given to execute, it frustrates, and it makes you very very desperate in how you move about business sometimes. But I believe things have changed significantly. However, I believe more should be done so that that frustration is eliminated and councillors and councils are allowed to really work effectively in the interest of people.
Okay, thank you. Among the issues that are being faced at the level of communities are issues that young people face. Does local government facilitate issues faced by these young people in their communities?
Exactly. Local government is a ball field to be looked at. We have many young people who are involved in recreational activities, whether it's a community center. We take for granted what these centers mean many times. As a former chairman, I can say to you, these centers in many cases are the foundation by which you have communities existing in terms of people being able to share a common space, share ideas, and also share the different passions that they have for the community. They can learn in those centers. So, and it is affected by local government identifying the location to even raising the resources and having the actual intended purpose for those centers outlined. And if you don't, so that is just one area in terms of how important local government is towards those sort of initiatives that affect the lives directly of young people. But more importantly, and I hear candidates speaking about education in a very broad context, and I know that it's more national in its definition. But however, local authorities also participate in so many other things education wise for young people outside of recreation, and also in many other areas of their complete development of young people. But this is one of the areas I believe young people have not been so inclined to participate in this local government process, because they don't see that level of connection, direct connection of how local authorities or the decisions made by local authorities directly impact or affect their lives. But it does directly.
Okay, so the final area.
No, I would say,
okay,
if I
go
can
ahead.
add, from an activity
Sure.
perspective, our local authorities have not been as active as they can be in the area of culture. They have not been as active as they can be in TechVoc kind of training. They have not been as active as they can be in terms of empowerment exercises and the recreational aspect that Sharma spoke to. There's a lot that local authorities can do that has nothing to do with central government in terms of providing space, providing facilities, providing technical education, uh, providing opportunities for them to be involved in culture, even the youth activity itself, youth training and youth development. There's nothing precluding local authorities from becoming involved in that. So there's tremendous scope. It just takes the kind of vision for the leadership in those local authorities to reach out and to do things with and for young people. And I want to emphasize that, with and for, because there's a tendency to want to do things to.
Yes.
And the to is not always correct. So the with and for is very, very critical. There is the scope for local authorities to be so involved. And you take a place like Georgetown, with some of the problems you have with the squatting areas, and the need to identify community buildings where children can go to in the afternoons as homework centers. It's within the scope of the local authority to get that. And in fact, some people don't even recognize some of the things local authorities do. I was speaking to some people yesterday, and we were counting the number of daycare centers that local authorities are responsible for in Georgetown. And people seem to forget that this ever exists. It's as if they're there, yes, but it's not a local authority, somebody else. So that there are two things here I'm emphasizing. One, there's need for greater recognition of what they do. Because there are things they do we don't give them recognition for. And there is scope for them to do much more than they presently do.
Okay. So the final issue before we close the program. Since this is a Copy 250 program, I want both of you to talk about the effects of all of this on the African Guyanese community. How are they affected by local government elections, and why should they go out and vote?
Well, I would say it this way. I have always made the point that given the plural nature of our society, that the evolution of power can provide various groups with opportunities to take their destiny into their own hands. The reality is that we have physical, ethnic enclaves in this country. That's the reality, whether you like it or not. And therefore, if you devolve power onto communities, then those enclaves, without competing with others, will have the scope to be in charge of the things that affect them. And so this will not be a situation of perpetuating the divide. It will be a situation of recognizing at levels at which communities have interests that are not the interests of other communities, and allowing them the scope to be responsible for their own communities, looking after their own interests, and not being able to cast aspersions on the central government, say, well, the central government is discriminating, they're going there, they're not coming here. Put it in the hands of the people themselves, and let them do their thing. If they don't do their thing, they'll have no one else to blame.
To Coffee 250, I believe, as we've started this, I started by saying that the African movement in Guyana started local government through the village movement. This is us embracing our culture. Local government is our culture. It is where we found the resources from self to build and purchase villages and infrastructure, and all those things that local government is intended to do now. So in essence, it is no different than what our ancestors, Coffee 250, and what you promoted, Coffee 250, is encouraging the African Guyanese or the Afro-Guyanese to do or to participate in. It is something that is inherent in our system of existence. It is the foundation of Guyana, our cooperative spirit of coming together as communities, identifying leaders, identifying issues, having a collective approach to fixing them. And it is part of the psyche of the African Guyanese. It is how we came together and we purchased and we did tremendous things. So local government and what it holds for us is more than just what we see happening today. It is what we have originated from that we're actually returning to, which is having power given back to our local communities.
Okay, and with that, we've come to the end of this evening's program. I know you're looking at your watch, Vincent. Yes, an hour has expired already. So I want to thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Sharma, for being on African Drums and for talking about these pertinent issues.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
You're welcome. Viewers, thank you for staying with us. This has been African Drums, the television organ of the Cuffy 250 Committee, an organization dedicated to the empowerment of the African Guyanese community through education and to the encouragement of self-activity. Please like our Facebook page, it's Cuffy 250. Also subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is also Cuffy 250. And send us an email, cuffy250gy@gmail.com. We'd love to have your questions and comments, as well as please donate to the cause. Thank you for watching. I'm Elsie Harry, encouraging you to go out and vote on March 18th. Please join me next time.